In the beginning of the biblical account, there is a rhythm. God speaks, something comes into being. And then, at the end of each day, an evaluation is offered. The Hebrew word is tov, good, not merely functional, not simply present, but aligned with purpose, ordered, right. When the sixth day closes and the whole of the created world stands complete, sky and sea, earth and living creature, man and woman, the evaluation expands. Not merely tov, very good. This is the baseline. This is the standard the text sets before anything else is introduced. And it matters because what follows in the biblical narrative cannot be understood without it. The story of Scripture is not simply a story about God and humanity. It is a story about something breaking into a world that was made whole, and what happens to creation, to history, to the human heart when the fracture is allowed to spread. There are four presences in the biblical text that do not belong to that original evaluation. Not because the authors forgot them, not because they were minor footnotes in an otherwise tidy story, but because the text itself situates them outside the created order as God declared it. They are not products of the seventh day. They are not listed among the living creatures shaped on the fifth or sixth. They arrive later, through choices, through rebellion, through the bending of what was made good into something else entirely. Understanding what these four presences are, where they come from, what the biblical text actually says about them, and how ancient interpreters read that evidence, requires going slowly. It requires looking at the original language, at the historical and cultural world in which these texts were written, and at the broader theological architecture that holds the Hebrew Scriptures together. This is not a mystery in the sensational sense. The biblical writers do not tease these subjects. They address them with a kind of sober gravity, woven into the larger story of covenant, exile, redemption, and judgment. But they do require patient reading. They require the willingness to sit with what the text says, to examine what ancient Near Eastern culture would have assumed without explaining, and to distinguish carefully between what the Scripture states and what later tradition built upon it. The world the biblical authors inhabited was not the world of modern Western rationalism. It was a world populated by unseen forces, by spiritual beings who acted within history, by powers that were believed to stand behind earthly events. The Israelites did not invent this cosmology. They shared it, in many ways, with their Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and Egyptian neighbors. What made the Hebrew tradition distinct was not its denial of these beings, but its insistence that they were all creatures, all subordinate to the one God who made everything, who could not be manipulated by ritual or appeased by offering, who ruled over every spiritual power that existed. That distinction is the key to reading what follows. None of the four presences this script will examine are rivals to God in the biblical framework. None of them are eternal. None of them possess independent creative power. They are all, in different ways, creatures who turned, or were turned, into something other than what they were made to be. The first of these presences emerges from one of the most debated and difficult passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is a passage only 4 verses long. It sits near the beginning of the flood narrative, and for centuries, readers have argued about what it means. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. The account says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and that they took wives from among them. From these unions, the Nephilim were born, and those Nephilim, the text says, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward 4 verses. And within them, one of the most contested questions in the entire tradition: who were the sons of God? Chapter 2. The sons of God, and the breaking of a boundary. The phrase Bene Ha-Elohim, sons of God, does not appear often in the Hebrew Bible, but where it does appear, the context is significant. In the book of Job, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord. They are not human. They are members of a divine assembly, heavenly beings who stand in the presence of God. The same language appears in Psalm 29 and Psalm 89, where the sons of God are invoked in the context of heavenly worship and cosmic governance. The phrase carries a specific meaning in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamian literature, in Ugaritic texts, in the cosmological traditions that surrounded ancient Israel on every side. The sons of God referred to divine or semi-divine beings who populated the heavenly realm. They were not gods in the full sense, not rivals to the Most High, but they were spiritual beings of a higher order than humanity. In the Genesis 6 passage, something goes wrong. These beings cross a boundary. They see the daughters of men. The phrase emphasizes their humanity, their ordinary creatureliness, and they take them as wives. The verb used for taking is not neutral. It is the same verb used elsewhere in the Hebrew text when something is seized, acquired, claimed without proper right. There is force in it, or at the very least transgression. The result is the Nephilim. The word itself is debated. Some derive it from the Hebrew root naphal, to fall. Others connect it to a root meaning mighty or powerful. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, known as the Septuagint, renders the word as gigantes, giants, and that rendering shaped much of how later tradition understood the Nephilim, as enormous, terrifying beings, half human and half divine. But it is important to be precise about what the text actually says and what it does not. Genesis 6:4 calls the Nephilim the mighty ones of old, men of renown. The word translated giants refers not necessarily to physical stature, but to something overwhelming, something that does not belong to the ordinary human world. It is only later, in Numbers 13, that the Nephilim appear in connection with size. When the Israelite spies return from Canaan and report that they felt like grasshoppers in the presence of these beings. By the time of Numbers, many centuries have passed in the biblical narrative. The flood has come and gone. The world has been remade. And yet the Nephilim, or descendants connected to the same lineage, are still present in the land. The text in Numbers 13:33 names them explicitly as descendants of Anak, a clan also called the Anakim. Elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, related groups appear under different names. Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim. They are consistently described as being of unusual stature, as occupying the land God promised to Israel, as obstacles to be confronted and removed. What the text seems to suggest is that the boundary crossing in Genesis 6 produced something that did not simply disappear with the flood. Whatever the Nephilim were, however, one interprets their precise nature. Their presence extended into the story of Israel in Canaan, creating a thread of tension that runs through the conquest narrative. The New Testament writers do not explain the Genesis 6 account in detail, but they reference it in a way that suggests they understood the sons of God as spiritual beings who transgressed a boundary. The letter of Jude, in verse 6, speaks of angels who did not stay within their proper domain, who abandoned their appointed dwelling, and who are now held in eternal chains under darkness, awaiting judgment. 2 Peter 2:4 speaks of God not sparing angels when they sinned, but casting them down to Tartarus and committing them to chains of gloomy darkness. These are not extended theological treatises. They are brief, pointed references, but they share a consistent interpretation with the reading that understands Genesis 6 as describing a genuine transgression by heavenly beings, a violation of the created order that produced an anomaly. Beings who were neither fully human nor fully divine, who occupied the world without belonging to the world as it was made. This is why the Nephilim occupy a particular kind of place in the biblical imagination. They are not simply enemies. They are not simply large people. They are the visible evidence that something had already gone wrong, not just within the human heart, but at a level above and beyond human history. The fracture in creation had begun before the flood, and it left marks. There is a detail in Genesis 6 that is easy to pass over, but worth holding carefully. After describing the unions of the sons of God with human women and the birth of the Nephilim, the text moves almost immediately into the account of God's grief. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. His heart was grieved. He decided to send the flood. The text does not separate these two events as if they were unrelated. The transgression of the sons of God, the presence of the Nephilim, and the decision to bring a catastrophic judgment are placed in direct sequence. The ancient rabbis who wrestled with this passage, and the writers of the Second Temple period who developed its implications most fully, understood them as connected. The flood was not simply a response to human moral failure. It was a response to the contamination of the human world by beings who did not belong there. The Book of Enoch, which is not part of the canonical Hebrew Bible, but was widely read in Second Temple Judaism, and is cited in the letter of Jude, develops this interpretation at length. It describes these beings as watchers who fell, who taught human beings forbidden arts, whose hybrid offspring ravaged the earth. The text of Genesis itself does not go this far, but the resonance between Genesis 6 and the later literature suggests that this reading was not an invention of later theologians. It was present in the tradition very early. What is certain is that the Nephilim represent something outside the created order, as God declared it good. They are the product of a boundary being broken. They are what happens when a spiritual being abandons the domain in which it was placed and enters a domain that was not made for it. And their continued presence in the Canaanite narrative, in those reports of fearsome beings who make the spies feel like grasshoppers, is a reminder that the fracture opened in the antediluvian world was not simply sealed by the waters of the flood. Chapter 3. The creature in the garden, the second presence that stands outside God's original evaluation, appears at the very beginning of human history, as the biblical text describes it. Before the flood, before the Nephilim, before the long genealogies of Genesis, there is the garden. And in the garden, there is a conversation. Genesis 3 opens with a description that has puzzled readers for millennia. The serpent, the text says, was more crafty than all the beasts of the field that the Lord God had made. The word translated crafty, aram in Hebrew, is the same word used just before, in the final verse of Genesis 2, to describe Adam and Eve as naked and unashamed. The similarity is not accidental. The text is creating a contrast. What is plain and open and without guile in the human couple becomes shrewd and calculating in the serpent. And then the serpent speaks. This is the first anomaly. The serpent speaks. No other animal in the Genesis narrative speaks. The text offers no explanation for this. It simply happens. And it happens in a way that reveals immediately that this creature is operating with a kind of intelligence, a kind of intentionality that goes beyond the animals that were created to fill the earth. The Hebrew word for serpent is nachash, but the root of the word carries other meanings: to shine, to whisper, to observe with intent, to divine or enchant. The linguistic field of the word suggests something that moves in shadow, that communicates in ways beneath the surface, that perceives what others do not. Scholars of the Hebrew language have noted that Nakash can carry the connotation of a glittering, bright creature, not a dull, crawling thing, but something luminous. This detail matters because of what comes later in the text. After Eve has eaten, after Adam has eaten, after God comes to walk in the garden and finds them hiding, the Lord turns to the serpent and delivers a curse. He says the serpent will crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. The implication, which ancient readers recognized immediately, is that the serpent had a different mode of existence before this moment. It did not always crawl. The curse is a demotion, a diminishment, a reduction of something that had previously moved in a different way. This is important. The serpent that speaks in the garden is not the serpent as we encounter it in the natural world. It is a creature that has been changed, limited, brought low by its role in what happened in the garden. What it was before, what kind of being inhabited that form, or animated it, or spoke through it, is something the Genesis text does not explicitly describe, but the trajectory of the biblical narrative makes it impossible to read the garden serpent as simply an unusual reptile. The book of Revelation, at two separate points, uses language that connects the serpent of Eden directly to a figure of cosmic spiritual opposition. In Revelation 12:9, the great dragon is described as the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. In Revelation 22, the same identification is made, the ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan. The New Testament writers did not invent this connection, they received it. It was already present in the interpretive tradition of Second Temple Judaism, which consistently identified the garden serpent not as a mere animal, but as a vehicle or instrument of a malicious spiritual power. The implication is that in the garden, a spiritual being, one whose nature the text does not fully disclose at this point, used the form of the serpent to approach the human couple. The serpent as a created animal was part of the good creation. The serpent as a vehicle of deception was something else, a hijacked instrument, a created form turned to purposes that ran directly against the order God had established. This interpretation has a sophistication that is sometimes missed in popular reading. It does not require the serpent to be a disguise or a puppet in a crude sense. It requires only that the created form of the serpent was the medium through which something external to the created order, something already fallen, already opposed to the design of God, made contact with the human world. The serpent existed, it was real, it was a creature, but something used it, spoke through it, and corrupted it to a purpose that the creation was never meant to serve. The conversation the serpent initiates with Eve is one of the most closely analyzed dialogues in all of biblical literature. It begins with a subtle distortion of what God had actually said. The serpent's question implies that God had prohibited eating from every tree in the garden, when in fact God had prohibited only one. Eve corrects this, but she also adds something of her own. She says they were told not even to touch the fruit. That addition is not in the original command God gave. It is a small thing, but the conversation is already operating in the space between what God said and what the human beings remember God saying. Then the serpent moves to direct contradiction. You will not surely die. The word surely is a translation of a Hebrew emphatic construction. God had said, dying you will die. The serpent negates it in the same emphatic construction. Not dying will you die. It is a direct logical inversion of the divine word. What follows is an insinuation that God had withheld the fruit because eating it would make the human beings like God, knowing good and evil. This insinuation is layered. It implies that God's command was motivated by fear, by a desire to keep the human creatures subordinate, to prevent them from becoming what they could be. It reframes the prohibition not as a gift, a boundary set to protect, but as a cage. This rhetorical move is the template for a certain kind of spiritual deception as the Bible describes it. It does not deny God entirely. It reinterprets God's character. It transforms the protector into the withholder. It makes obedience look like diminishment. The consequence of the conversation and of the choices that follow is not simply individual moral failure. The biblical account presents it as a rupture in the structure of the created world. The relationship between God and humanity, between humanity and the earth, between male and female, between the human creature and death, all of these are described as changed, disordered, broken along lines that the original creation did not contain. And there is a word spoken in the garden that the text marks as especially important. Genesis 3:15. God addresses the serpent, not Eve, not Adam, but the serpent, and says there will be enmity between the serpent and the woman, between its offspring and her offspring. The offspring of the woman will bruise the serpent's head, the serpent will bruise his heel. This passage, which the Church Fathers called the Proto-Evangelium, the first Gospel, has been read in many ways across the history of biblical interpretation. In its immediate context, it describes the ongoing antagonism between human beings and snakes. At that level, it explains something about the natural world as the text understands it. But the language, offspring, head, heel, bruise, carries a weight that extends far beyond the enmity between people and reptiles. It points forward, it promises a resolution. It names the serpent as something more than a serpent, and names the woman's offspring as something more than an ordinary human descendant. The serpent in the garden then occupies a strange position in the biblical account. It was made, it was a creature, it was part of the world God created, but it became something else through the presence and purpose of a power that opposed God's design. And the words spoken over it in Genesis 3 set in motion a thread of conflict that would not be resolved until the very end of the biblical narrative. Chapter 4, The Bronze Serpent and the Shadow of the Cross there, is a moment in the wilderness story of Israel that most readers pass over quickly. The people are traveling through harsh desert terrain after their escape from Egypt. They are exhausted, hungry, and angry. They speak against God and against Moses. The text says venomous snakes came among them and bit many people, and many died. Moses prays on behalf of the people. God instructs him to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Anyone who has been bitten and looks at the bronze serpent will live. This passage in Numbers 21 has puzzled interpreters for as long as it has been read. Why would God instruct Moses to make an image of the very thing that was killing people? The Torah had been unambiguous in its prohibition of images. The worship of images of animals was associated throughout the Hebrew scriptures with idolatry. And yet here, the snake on a pole is not an idol to be worshipped, but a sight to be looked at. And the looking itself produces life. What is being enacted in this ritual? Some commentators have suggested that the bronze serpent functions as a kind of visual acknowledgement. The people are forced to look directly at what has harmed them, to confront the consequence of their rebellion as the condition for receiving healing. Others have read it as a visual paradox. That which brings death, when lifted up before God's people through God's instruction, becomes the instrument of salvation. The most striking interpretation comes from the Gospel of John. In chapter 3, Jesus is speaking with a Pharisee named Nicodemus, who has come to him at night. Jesus says, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." This is immediately followed by the most quoted verse in the New Testament. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." The connection Jesus makes is explicit and deliberate. The bronze serpent and the crucifixion are placed in direct parallel. What was lifted up on the pole in the wilderness and the one who would be lifted up on the cross are presented as belonging to the same logic. The thing associated with curse and death and the rebellion in the garden, when it is raised up in the context of God's redeeming purpose, becomes the sign of life. This interpretive move is part of a broader pattern in the biblical narrative, where images and objects associated with darkness or judgment are reclaimed within the story of redemption. It does not rehabilitate the serpent in the garden or the spiritual power that spoke through it. It does something more complex. It shows that even the symbols of sin and death can be transformed within God's economy into vehicles of healing and life. The bronze serpent itself had a troubled later history. 2 Kings 18:4 tells us that Hezekiah, the reforming king of Judah, destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made because the people had been burning incense to it. By that time, it had acquired a name, Nehushtan. It had become an object of veneration. The thing made to be looked at had become a thing worshipped. the instrument of the divine command had become an idol. This detail is not accidental. It illustrates one of the recurring tensions in the Hebrew scriptures, that the boundary between a legitimate sign of God's activity and a corrupted religious object is fragile, especially over time, especially in the hands of communities who forget the origin and context of the things they inherit. But the Gospel of John does not look back to Nehushtan the idol. It looks back to the serpent on the pole in the wilderness, to the moment when Moses held it up and the dying looked and lived. And it reads in that event, a foreshadowing of the moment when the one who took on the form of a servant was lifted up on a cross, bearing the weight of what the serpent had introduced in the garden. The theological logic of this connection runs deep. The first serpent, the one in the garden, was the vehicle of a lie. The lie said that rebellion against God would lead to life, to becoming like God, to freedom from limitation. The bronze serpent, and by extension in John's Gospel, the crucifixion itself, reverses this entirely. Life comes not through reaching up to grasp what God has not given, but through God, reaching down into the very place of curse and death. The wound opens the way to the healer. The dying turn toward the sign and are preserved. This is not a coincidence of imagery. It is a deep structural feature of the biblical narrative. The way the text circles back on its own symbols and reinterprets them, carries them forward, inverts them, and fills them with meanings that could not have been seen at the first reading, but become undeniable when the full shape of the story emerges. The serpent in the garden was not designed by God to deceive. The living creature that the spiritual power used was made and declared good. But once the deception was enacted, once the fracture opened, the consequences moved forward through history in ways that required more than a simple reversal. They required transformation. And the biblical text suggests that transformation was not accomplished by force alone, but by a kind of unexpected reversal, where the wound itself becomes the site of healing. Chapter 5. What the Gospels found in the world by the time the Gospels are written, something has become evident from even a surface reading of the texts. The world they describe is populated by unseen forces that operate in and through the human world, with an intensity and visibility that the earlier Hebrew scriptures only occasionally make explicit. Jesus enters communities, and the Gospels record almost immediately encounters with beings that are not human, beings that speak, that recognize him, that react to his presence with something that can only be described as terror. They are called in the Greek texts daimonia, demons, and they appear with a regularity in the Gospel narratives that has troubled careful readers for centuries, because the Gospel writers do not seem to be constructing a symbolic or metaphorical framework. They describe these encounters as events that happened in real time, in specific places, to specific people. The word daimonion does not appear in the creation account of Genesis. It is not present in the list of things God made. Whatever these beings are, they are not part of the created order as it is described in the opening chapters of the Hebrew Bible. The modern reader often arrives at this subject carrying a framework shaped more by the Enlightenment than by either the ancient world or the biblical text itself. The tendency is to move quickly toward explanation, toward a pathology, a cultural misunderstanding, a metaphor for psychological disturbance. These framings are not without value, and serious biblical scholarship does not simply dismiss the question of what the Gospel writers thought they were observing, but the honest reading of the texts requires acknowledging that the Gospel writers were not confused about whether what they were describing was literal. They believed it was, and the encounters they describe have a consistent character. The beings Jesus confronts in the Gospels know who he is. They name him. In Mark 1:24, an unclean spirit speaks to Jesus in the synagogue at Capernaum and says, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." In Mark 5:7, The being that speaks through the man in the Gerasene graveyard uses the full divine name, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. They do not mistake him. They recognize him immediately, with a clarity that the human beings around him often lack. They also fear something specific, that he has come to destroy them before the time. The phrase "before the time" suggests that they are operating with an awareness of a coming judgment, that they exist in a period of reprieve, that their sentence has been pronounced, but not yet executed. This is not the language of fantasy literature. It is the language of creatures who exist within a theological framework, where judgment is real, where time moves toward a reckoning, and where the arrival of a particular person signals that the reckoning is closer than they feared. The question the tradition has wrestled with is, where did these beings come from? Two primary answers exist within the biblical and early Jewish tradition, and neither is mutually exclusive of the other. The first is that some of these beings are fallen members of the heavenly council, angels who, in some form or at some moment, aligned themselves with the rebellion against God rather than with his governance. Revelation 12:7-9 describes a heavenly conflict in which Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The figure the text identifies as Satan, and the dragon and his angels were cast down. Matthew 25:41 speaks of an eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. The consistent use of the plural suggests that the rebellion of the figure who opposes God was not solitary, that it drew others into it, that a portion of the heavenly beings made a choice that aligned them with the adversary, rather than with the God who made them. This first category of fallen beings, heavenly beings who chose rebellion, forms one stream of what the New Testament calls demonic power. The second answer comes from the same well of tradition that generated the interpretation of Genesis 6 as describing spiritual beings who crossed a boundary to mate with human women. If the Nephilim were hybrid beings, neither fully human nor fully spiritual, then when they died, their position was anomalous. They had no clear destination. They were not human souls, who in the Hebrew understanding were connected to the earth and to God's care for the human image bearers. They were not spiritual beings with an appointed domain. They were something in between. The literature of Second Temple Judaism, particularly texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, develops this idea at some length. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, in this tradition, are the entities that wander the earth seeking to inhabit physical bodies, to experience the material world they were cut off from when their bodies died. They are the spirits of beings who were themselves products of a transgression, and their wandering is a kind of perpetual echo of the transgression that produced them. This second interpretation has an interesting resonance with a passage in Matthew 12:43-45, where Jesus speaks of an unclean spirit that has gone out of a person and wanders through waterless places seeking rest. When it cannot find rest, it returns to the person it left, bringing 7 more spirits more evil than itself. The language of seeking rest, of requiring a habitation, of restless movement through empty and dry spaces. This fits the idea of a disembodied being for whom the material world is both a memory and an urgent need. These two origins are not contradictions. They may both be true. They may describe different subsets of what the New Testament calls demonic power. What unites them is that neither category belongs to the created order as it was declared good. Both represent the consequences of transgression, one from the rebellion of heavenly beings, the other from the anomalous condition of hybrid beings who never belonged fully to either the heavenly or the earthly world. Chapter 6. The man called Legion there is one encounter in the Gospels that stands apart from the others, not because the events themselves are more dramatic than the healings or the conflict scenes in the synagogues, but because of the density of information it contains and the scale of what it describes. The account appears in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, but Mark's version in chapter 5 is the most detailed. Jesus and his disciples have crossed the Sea of Galilee, arriving on the eastern shore in the region of the Gerasenes, a predominantly Gentile area, which is significant. Before they have fully disembarked, a man comes running toward them from among the tombs. He lives among the tombs. He cannot be bound. Chains have been tried and have been broken. He roams the hills and the burial places, crying out, cutting himself with stones. The Gospels describe his condition with a clinical precision that is unusual for ancient literature, not the vague language of spiritual possession in religious texts, but a specific portrait of a specific person in a state of sustained, violent, and chronic torment. When he reaches Jesus, he falls down before him. And then the being or beings speaking through him say, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to me by God that you won't torture me." The torment they fear is real to them. They are addressing the Son of God, not from a position of power, but from a position of desperation. The theological note is striking. These beings, thousands of them, according to what comes next, know exactly who Jesus is. They use his name, his title, his lineage. They understand what his presence means, and they are afraid. Jesus asks, "What is your name?" "Legion," the being answers. "For we are many." The word is Roman. A Roman legion was a military formation of approximately 6,000 soldiers. Whether the number is meant literally or as a term for overwhelming multitude, the image is deliberate. The man is inhabited not by one but by a host, and the host uses a word drawn from the very empire that occupied the land of Israel at the time. The empire of military force, of occupation, of imposed submission. This detail has been read symbolically by some interpreters, that the use of the word legion in a Roman-occupied territory is the text's way of connecting spiritual oppression to political oppression, making a point about the nature of demonic power as analogous to imperial power. This reading is not implausible, but the Gospel of Mark is not primarily a work of political allegory. What the text describes is a specific encounter with a specific suffering person, and the spiritual realities the text presents are not reduced to metaphor by the historical and political resonances. The beings plead with Jesus not to send them out of the region. In Luke's account, they beg him not to send them to the abyss, a word that carries the same force as it does in the book of Revelation, the place of confinement for condemned spiritual powers. They do not want the abyss. They want to remain in the world. They want bodies. They beg to be allowed to enter a large herd of pigs feeding nearby on the hillside. Jesus permits it. The pigs run down the steep bank into the sea and drown, 2,000 of them. The reaction of the herdsmen who witness this, and of the townspeople who come out to see what happened, is not joy or gratitude. They are afraid. They ask Jesus to leave their region. Here is a man who was a source of terror, who could not be contained, who was destroying himself day and night in the hills among the dead. And when he is found sitting quietly, clothed in his right mind, the response of the community is fear, not of the man, of Jesus. There is something deeply human in this response. The disruption of an established order, even a terrible order, even an order built on suffering, produces a kind of fear in those whose lives have been organized around it. The known terror is, in some way, more manageable than the unknown power that removed it. The man himself asks to go with Jesus. Jesus refuses. He tells him, "Go back to your home, to your family, and tell them what the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." The man becomes a messenger in the Decapolis, the 10 cities of the Gentile Eastern Shore, telling what Jesus had done. This is worth noting. In many of his healings, Jesus instructs those he heals to say nothing. Here, in Gentile territory, far from the tensions of Judea and Galilee, he does the opposite. He sends the man as a witness into the 10 cities. The man who had been the region's nightmare becomes its witness to mercy. The encounter with Legion does not lend itself to easy doctrinal conclusions. It is too specific, too strange, too rooted in a particular place and a particular human tragedy to be reduced to a theology lesson. But it demonstrates, with extraordinary clarity, several things that the biblical text consistently asserts about these beings. They exist in the material world without belonging to it. They require habitation and are restless without it. They know who Jesus is and fear him, and the one who was most damaged by their presence, most defined by their control, is the one Jesus restores. The restoration itself is simple and human. He is clothed, he is seated, he is in his right mind. These three details, clothing, posture, sanity, are the marks of a human being who has been returned to himself, not transformed into something greater than human, but restored to what he was before the invasion. The miracle is not spectacle for its own sake. It is the return of a person to his humanity. Chapter 7, the worship behind the idols there, is a passage in the book of Deuteronomy, in the great song that Moses sings near the end of his life, that opens a window into one of the deepest concerns of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. It is not a passage that receives much attention in popular reading, but ancient Jewish and early Christian interpreters drew from it extensively. Moses is reflecting on Israel's history of unfaithfulness. He describes the people sacrificing to Sheddim, a Hebrew word that is sometimes translated as demons, sometimes as false gods, sometimes as worthless idols. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced in Alexandria in the centuries before Christ, renders Sheddim as daimonia. Demons, the parallel passage in Psalm 106 uses the same word. The people sacrifice to Sheddim. They sacrifice their sons and their daughters to demons. This is not metaphorical language. It is a claim about the spiritual reality operating behind the idols of Canaan and the surrounding nations. This claim is important to understand within the worldview the biblical text assumes. The Hebrew tradition was not arguing that the gods of the nations were mere wood and stone with no power. That argument appears at certain points in the prophets. Isaiah in particular mocks the worship of carved images with cutting irony. But the deeper claim, the one running through Deuteronomy and the Psalms and reappearing in Paul's letters, is more complex. The images are nothing, but what the images represent, what receives the worship directed toward them, is not nothing. It is something. It is a spiritual reality that has no legitimate claim to that worship, that is using the shape of human religious impulse to receive what belongs to God alone. Paul takes up this thread explicitly in his first letter to the Corinthians. He is dealing with a practical question. Can a Christian eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols in pagan temples? His answer is nuanced. The idol itself, he says, is nothing. There is no other God. But what the pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons, not to God. And he does not want the Corinthian believers to be participants with demons. This is a striking passage. Paul is not arguing that pagan worship is simply misguided or culturally mistaken. He is arguing that there is a spiritual reality behind it, a reality that is not God, that is not deserving of worship, that is actively using the structures of human religion to redirect worship from the Creator to the creature. The idol is a mask, the demon is what wears it. This framework has significant implications for how the biblical text understands the spread and persistence of idolatry across human history. It is not simply a cultural phenomenon, a primitive stage through which civilization passes on its way to monotheism. It is a sustained spiritual strategy, the use of human religious impulse, which is real and deep and universal, as a means of positioning lesser powers in the place that belongs to God alone. The nations that surrounded Israel were not, in this understanding, simply ignorant. They were under a kind of governance by spiritual powers that had their own purposes and their own enmity with the God of Israel. The conflicts between Israel and the surrounding nations were not only political or military or cultural. they had a spiritual dimension, a contest between the claims of the God of Israel and the claims of the powers that held the surrounding peoples in their domain. This is why the conquest narratives in the Hebrew scriptures, which trouble modern readers deeply and, for legitimate reasons, carry a theological weight that cannot be understood outside this framework. The Canaanite cities that Israel was commanded to displace were not simply ordinary human communities. They were, in the biblical account, the sites of spiritual systems organized around the worship of beings who were not God. Systems that included, in some cases, the sacrifice of children, ritual sexual practice, and the consecration of human life to powers that had no rightful claim to it. This does not resolve all the moral difficulties of those narratives. The biblical text itself shows ambivalence about the violence of the conquest, but it explains the intensity of the divine reaction, the reason the displacement was commanded at all, the reason the text does not present it as mere real estate acquisition, but as the removal of a corrupted, spiritual ecosystem from the land God had designated for his covenant people. The Shedim of Deuteronomy, the Daimonia of the Septuagint, the demons Paul warns the Corinthians about. These are not a separate topic from the Nephilim or the garden serpent. They are part of the same fabric. They are all, in different ways, presences in the human world that do not belong to the created order as it was declared good. They represent the ongoing consequences of the fractures that opened in the first chapters of the biblical story, and they explain why the world the biblical text describes is a world where the stakes of human choice, worship, and allegiance are not simply personal. They are cosmic,